My son brought his girlfriend home for Christmas dinner last year, and I thought she was wonderful. Truly. I remember standing at the kitchen counter, stirring the cranberry sauce, watching them through the pass-through window as they hung their coats by the door. She was laughing at something he'd said, a real laugh, head thrown back. And I thought, finally, someone who makes him happy. Her name was Chloe. 29 years old, worked in marketing at a firm downtown in Ottawa, had a warm smile, and brought a bottle of Riesling from the Niagara Peninsula. She complimented my tablecloth. She helped set the plates without being asked. My daughter-in-law from my older son kept catching my eye across the kitchen with this little nod. Like, she's lovely, isn't she? And she was. At first. I want to be clear about something before I go on. I am not a meddlesome mother. I raised 2 sons mostly on my own after my husband passed in 2009, and I made a decision early on that my job was to launch them, not to hover. When my older son married his wife 12 years ago, I stepped back. I gave them space. I was not the mother-in-law who called every Sunday to check whether they were eating properly. I was proud of that. So when I tell you what I started to notice over those 3 days my son and Chloe stayed with me that Christmas, I need you to understand I did not go looking for it. I did not want to find it. Every instinct I had told me to look away. But some things, once you see them, you cannot unsee. It started the first evening, before dinner was even on the table. My son, his name is Patrick, he is 32 years old, a civil engineer. One of the quietest, most even-tempered people I have ever known, went out to the garage to bring in the folding chairs we needed for the table. He was gone maybe 4 minutes. When he came back inside, Chloe was standing in the kitchen doorway, and the look on her face stopped me cold. Not angry, exactly. Something more controlled than that. She was watching him with this very still, very flat expression, and she said quietly, "I texted you." Patrick looked at his phone. "Sorry, I didn't feel it vibrate." "I texted you twice." He set the chairs down. "I was just in the garage." "I know where you were." She turned back toward the living room. "It's fine." It wasn't a fight. There was no raised voice. If I had blinked, I might have missed it entirely. I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand, and I told myself it was nothing. Couples communicate differently. She probably just wanted to know where he was. We all have our quirks. I told myself that for approximately 48 hours. Christmas morning, we opened gifts around the tree. My older son and his wife drove over from Kanata around 10, brought the grandchildren, and the living room was loud and happy and smelled like coffee and pine. Patrick was on the floor with his niece, helping her figure out some craft kit she'd gotten, and he looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen the night before. Loose-shouldered, laughing easily, like himself. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. I wasn't trying to read it. I was walking past to refill my coffee mug, and the screen was lit face up, and I saw the notification before I could stop myself. "Why haven't you responded to my last 2 messages? I can see you're online." Chloe was sitting 8 feet away on the couch. I kept walking to the kitchen. I poured my coffee. I stood there for a moment with my back to the room, and I breathed. She had texted him while they were in the same house, while he was sitting on the floor 10 feet away from her, playing with a 6-year-old. She had texted him twice, noted that he hadn't responded, checked whether he was online, and texted again. I thought about the night before. I texted you. I thought about the way he'd apologized for being in the garage. I went back into the living room and sat down in my armchair, and I watched them for the rest of the morning in a way I hadn't let myself before. Not staring, just paying attention. The kind of attention you learn when you've lived long enough to know what trouble looks like when it's wearing a pleasant face. Patrick responded to the text within 30 seconds. He typed quickly, glanced up at Chloe, and she gave him a small smile and looked back at her phone. The exchange took maybe 10 seconds. To anyone else in the room, it would have looked like nothing at all. That afternoon, my older son pulled me aside in the kitchen while Chloe was in the shower and Patrick was watching the game. "Everything okay with those two?" he asked. I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, the way he does when he doesn't want to make a big deal of something. "I don't know. He just seems—" He stopped. "Never mind. I'm probably reading into it. Tell me." He leaned against the counter and lowered his voice. "When you and Chloe were talking about the Boxing Day plans this morning, Patrick said he thought he might go skating at Lansdowne with me and the kids, and she didn't say anything in the moment. But then later I saw them in the hallway, and she was talking very quietly to him, and he came back and said he actually couldn't make it." I nodded slowly. "He loves skating," my older son said. "He's been talking about taking the kids since October." I knew that. I was the one who'd bought the tickets. "He said he forgot he promised Chloe they'd do something together," Patrick had told his brother. "Perfectly reasonable. Couples plan things, schedules change. Except that Chloe had told me that morning, while Patrick was making breakfast, that she didn't really have any plans for Boxing Day. 'I'm easy,' she'd said brightly. 'Whatever everyone wants to do.' I thought about that for a long time. Here is the thing about this kind of control, and I have seen it before, in a colleague at the school board where I worked for 30 years, in a neighbor down the street, in a friend from my book club whose situation I will not get into detail about. It doesn't look the way people expect it to look. There is no shouting. There is no obvious cruelty. It is quiet. It is relentless. It is made up of 1,000 tiny moments that each seem, individually, perfectly reasonable and only become a pattern when you step back far enough to see all of them at once. My son was 32 years old, 6 feet tall, well-liked, successful. No one was going to look at him and think victim. That was part of why it had worked. I thought about the things I'd noticed over those 3 days. The way he checked his phone compulsively. The way he modulated his voice when he spoke to her. Careful, measured, like a man choosing his footing on ice. The way he declined the Boxing Day outing. The way he'd apologized for being in the garage. 4 minutes. He'd apologized for being in the garage for 4 minutes. The question was what to do about it, if anything. I was his mother, not his keeper. He was an adult. He would, rightfully, resent me if I said something and was wrong. And even if I wasn't wrong, people in these situations often can't hear it. Not right away. You can't drag someone out of something they're not ready to leave. I knew that. But I also knew that doing nothing was its own kind of choice. Chloe and Patrick left the day after Boxing Day. The house felt very quiet afterward, the way it always does after Christmas. I washed the dishes and put the good tablecloth back in the linen closet and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I thought for a very long time. What I decided in the end was not dramatic. I wasn't going to call Patrick and tell him I thought his girlfriend was controlling. I wasn't going to issue any ultimatums or have a heart-to-heart intervention. I'd watched enough of those backfire to know better. What I decided was that I was going to stay close, more than I had been. I was going to call him more often. Not to check on things, just to talk. To make sure he remembered what it felt like to have a conversation where he wasn't monitoring himself. I was going to make sure the door was always clearly open. And I was going to find a way to talk to Chloe. Not to confront her, not to threaten or warn, just to talk to her woman to woman and see what I could see. The opportunity came in February, about 6 weeks later. Patrick had mentioned casually on the phone that Chloe was doing some professional development courses on Saturday mornings. She'd been talking about eventually moving into brand strategy, wanted to beef up her credentials. I filed that away. The following Saturday, I called Patrick around 10 in the morning. He answered, and I could tell from the background quiet that he was home alone. "I'm going to be in your neighborhood later," I told him. which was mostly true. I had a dental appointment near the Glebe in the afternoon. Do you want to get lunch? Just the two of us. There was a pause. A pause I recognized he was calculating. Chloe gets back around 1, he said. I was thinking more like 11:30. I have to be somewhere at 2. It would just be us. Another pause. Then, more quietly, yeah. That'd be really nice, actually. That actually broke my heart a little. We went to a small place on Bank Street, the kind of restaurant he'd loved since his 20s. Dark wood booths, good soup, hockey on a TV in the corner. He ordered a beer with his sandwich, and I noticed the way he relaxed into the booth the way he'd relaxed on the living room floor at Christmas when Chloe had been distracted by something else. We talked, really talked, about his work, about a project he was genuinely excited about his friends, about a book he was reading. He was funny, sharp. He was my son. About halfway through lunch, his phone buzzed. He looked at it, and something shifted slightly in his posture. Not dramatic, a small tightening. He set the phone face down on the table. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah. He picked up his sandwich. She just wanted to know where I was. I nodded. He put the sandwich down. She worries, he said, and he said it the way people say things they've said so many times they've stopped examining them. Does she know you're having lunch with your mom? I asked. I texted her this morning. And? Hen? He looked up at me. And she's fine with it. I know she is, I said. I'm asking if she knows. He was quiet for a moment. Patrick, I said carefully. How often does she check in when you're not with her? He looked out the window at the street. A long streetcar was rumbling down bank, a thin snow coming down, February gray over everything. He didn't answer for a moment. She likes to know where I am, he said finally. She's not controlling. She's just anxious. She had a relationship before me where the guy cheated, and she's never really gotten over it. I understand, I said. That kind of hurt takes a long time to heal. Exactly. But, sweetheart, I waited until he looked at me. Her past hurt is not your responsibility to manage. If she needs you to report your location every hour to feel safe, that's something she needs to work through with a therapist, not by monitoring you. He didn't say anything. Has she ever talked to anyone? A counselor? A flicker, something complicated crossed his face. I suggested it once. What happened? He looked back out the window. She got really upset. Said I was calling her crazy. We didn't talk about it again. I thought about that. About a woman who responded to a suggestion of therapy with an accusation. About a man who had learned not to bring it up again. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, I said. I'm not trying to make anything harder. You are a grown man, and I respect that. But I want you to hear something from me. And I want you to sit with it. And you don't have to say anything about it today. He nodded slowly. What she does, the constant check-ins, the monitoring, making you feel like you owe her an explanation for being in a garage, that isn't love. It's fear turned inside out. And when someone uses their fear to control another person, that becomes a problem. Not a personality quirk. A problem. The streetcar had disappeared around a corner. The snow was sticking now, light and dry. The kind that covers Ottawa before you notice it. I'm not saying she's a bad person, I continued. I genuinely don't know what she's been through. But I know what you look like when you're relaxed and happy, because I watched you grow up, and I know what you looked like at Christmas. And sweetheart, those weren't the same. He didn't argue. He didn't defend her. He stared at his soup for a long moment, and then he said, quietly, I'm really tired. It wasn't an agreement. It wasn't a decision. It was just the truth, finally said out loud. And sometimes that's the first thing that has to happen. I reached over and put my hand over his. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you decide, I'm not going anywhere. We finished lunch and walked back out into the February cold, and he hugged me on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, held on a little longer than usual. I drove to my dental appointment with my hands tight on the steering wheel, not from tension, but from the effort of not crying on the Queensway. I want to be honest about the next few months, because they were neat. Patrick didn't leave Chloe the next day, or the day after that. He called me more than he had been, sometimes just to talk. Sometimes quiet calls where I could tell he was in another room of his apartment and keeping his voice low. We spoke about other things mostly. I didn't push. I'd said what I needed to say in that restaurant booth on Bank Street, and saying it again would only push him away. In April, he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd started seeing a therapist. He framed it lightly, said it was just to work through some stress at work. I didn't probe, I just said that was a really good idea. In May, he told me he and Chloe were taking some time apart. He said it carefully, the way he said most things, watching for my reaction. I told him I was sorry and asked if he was okay. I think so, he said. I think I'm going to be okay. It is September now, and Patrick came to visit last month. He drove up from Ottawa on a Friday evening, arrived in time for dinner, and we sat on the back porch after we ate, watching the light go off the yard the way it does in late August, that long golden September almost light that comes through the maples. He was talking about a camping trip he was planning with some friends from university, friends I hadn't heard mentioned in a while, friends I suspected had gradually become less central over the past couple of years. He looked like himself. Not entirely healed. I don't think it works that quickly, and the therapist he's still seeing would probably have something to say about the work still to be done, but relaxed in a way that came from the inside out. Present, unmonitored. At one point, he looked over at me and said, "You know what you said at lunch? In February." Yes. I kept thinking about it. For months. I'd be in the middle of something and it would just come back to me. He paused. "I'm really glad you said it." I didn't say anything for a moment. There's a certain kind of happiness that sits too close to grief to survive a lot of talking. "I'm glad you heard it," I said finally. He nodded, and we sat there in the August light until the mosquitoes drove us inside. I am not telling this story because it has a tidy ending or because I handled everything perfectly. I didn't. There were moments I wanted to call Chloe and say things I had no right to say. There were moments I wondered whether I should have spoken sooner, or differently, or not at all. I am 63 years old and I still don't always know what the right thing is. But I know my son. I know the sound of his voice when he's free, and the sound of his voice when he isn't. I know what it means when he holds a hug on the sidewalk outside a Bank Street restaurant in February. You raise a child for 32 years, and the least you can do is pay attention. Some people have asked me, when I've mentioned any of this, carefully to close friends, whether I feel any sympathy for Chloe, and the honest answer is yes, I do. I believe, without any particular evidence, but with a lot of years of watching people, that she was not manufacturing her anxiety cynically. I believe she was genuinely frightened. That something in her past had taught her that love was something that ran away if you didn't hold it tightly enough. That is a terrible way to live. But my son was not responsible for healing it, and it was not love to make him try. Every time I see Patrick laughing easily, making plans without checking his phone, using his own voice, I know that the lunch on Bank Street was the right call, even on the days I wasn't sure. Especially on those days. I still think about Patrick's face in that restaurant booth on Bank Street. The way he said, "I'm really tired," not dramatically, not as a confession, just quietly. The way you'd say it after carrying something heavy for too long without telling anyone. That moment has stayed with me more than anything else from those months. There's a kind of cause and effect in human relationships that doesn't announce itself. It builds slowly, one small moment at a time. An apology for being in the garage, a text sent from 8 feet away, a skating trip quietly canceled. None of it looks like damage from the outside, but it accumulates. And eventually the person living inside it stops being fully themselves the way a plant grown in too little light stops reaching upward. Not dramatically, just gradually. What I've come to understand is that doing the right thing, the genuinely decent thing, is almost never the easy thing. It would have been easier for me to say nothing, to enjoy Christmas, to tell myself it wasn't my place, to protect my own comfort by not risking the relationship I had with my son. A part of me wanted to do exactly that. There is nothing virtuous about pretending otherwise. I was afraid. I didn't know whether I was reading the situation correctly. I didn't know whether he'd hear me or shut me out. But there's a kind of moral clarity that comes with age, I think. Not certainty, exactly, but a willingness to act on what you know even when you're not sure. I knew my son. I knew what his voice sounded like when he was free. I knew what his voice sounded like when he wasn't. And I decided that knowing something and staying silent about it was its own kind of failure. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet one. The kind you live with. The intelligence part, if I can call it that, was in how I approached it. Not a confrontation, not an ultimatum. A lunch. A conversation. One thing said, once, clearly, and then the door left open. I've seen well-meaning parents push too hard and lose their child entirely to the very situation they were trying to help them out of. That wasn't going to help Patrick. What he needed wasn't rescue. He needed someone to name what was happening and then trust him to do something with it. And the part that required the most from me, the part that was genuinely hard, was the waiting. The months of not knowing. The calls where I listened more than I spoke. The discipline of not pushing when every instinct said push. That kind of patience is not passive. It takes more out of you than speaking does. Patrick did the real work. He found a therapist, he made the decision, he rebuilt what had been quietly worn down. I just held a door open on Bank Street in February and told him the truth once, as plainly as I could. I don't think that makes me a good mother in any exceptional sense. I think it makes me someone who paid attention and then acted on what she saw, even when it was uncomfortable. That's all any of us can do, really. He's planning that camping trip now, with the university friends. I heard him on the phone last week making plans, laughing easily, not watching the door. That's enough for me. That's more than enough.